Mason, Kyle, and Brittany thought they were pulling off just another harmless heist inside a quiet Utah department store until the blare of an alarm turned their casual theft into a desperate chase through the mountains that would change their lives forever. It began on a quiet afternoon in Riverton, Utah, a town where not much ever seemed to happen. The streets were calm, and the parking lots outside the shopping center were half full with families and teenagers running weekend errands. The air smelled faintly of fresh rain, and the sun peeked through thick clouds that promised more weather later. Inside one of the larger department stores, three young friends Mason, Kyle, and Brittany wandered between aisles pretending to browse. To the casual eye, they looked harmless. They laughed occasionally, picked up items, and acted like they were trying to decide what to buy. In reality, they weren't shopping at all. Mason, the oldest and most confident of the group, had been the one who suggested they could make some easy money by taking small items and reselling them online. It had started weeks earlier with small things, a few makeup products, some headphones, and an expensive bottle of cologne. Each time they got away with it, their fear faded a little more. They convinced themselves it wasn't a big deal. No one got hurt, and the stores wouldn't even notice. It felt like a game to them, one that made their otherwise dull lives seem exciting. That day, though, the plan was different. Mason wanted to go for something bigger. He had noticed a new display of designer handbags and watches locked behind a glass case. Brittany, with her easy smile and calm demeanor, could distract the sales clerk while Kyle tried to quietly slip something out. They had done this routine before, but never for anything worth hundreds of dollars. This time, the risk was real. Still, the thrill was too tempting to resist. As the three moved through the aisles, the security cameras above silently followed every step. The store's loss prevention officer, a man who had worked there for years, noticed them almost immediately. He had seen the same nervous glances, the quick whispers, and the way Mason kept scanning for cameras. He decided to watch a little longer before acting. Meanwhile, Brittany stood by the display case pretending to admire the handbags. When the clerk stepped away to help another customer, she quickly slipped two of them into her oversized hoodie. Kyle, keeping lookout, nodded nervously toward the front. Mason casually grabbed a box containing a watch and tucked it under his jacket. It all happened in less than 30 seconds. Their plan was to walk straight out, get into their car, and leave before anyone realized what had happened. As they passed the registers, Brittany tried to keep her head down, hoping her pounding heart didn't show on her face. Just as Mason pushed open the glass doors, a sharp beep echoed through the air. The alarm at the exit blared to life, loud and unmistakable. The three froze for a moment, eyes wide, then bolted for the parking lot. Behind them, the store employee who had been watching picked up the phone and calmly called the police, reporting a theft in progress. The cameras kept recording as the trio sprinted to their old silver sedan, panic already setting in. In that instant, what had started as a small thrill turned into the first step of a disaster that none of them could stop. The alarm kept ringing long after they had sprinted across the parking lot. Mason's heart pounded as he fumbled for the keys, his hands slick with sweat. Kyle yanked open the passenger door, throwing himself inside, while Brittany struggled to catch her breath in the back seat. The sound of the alarm followed them into the car, echoing through the open window like a reminder of what they had just done. Mason twisted the ignition, the old engine sputtering before roaring to life. Without thinking, he slammed his foot on the gas and shot out of the lot. At first, it felt like they might actually get away with it. The main road ahead looked clear, and for a fleeting moment, Mason believed luck was on their side again. Kyle leaned back in his seat, laughing nervously, trying to convince himself it was fine. But in the rearview mirror, red and blue lights appeared faster than any of them expected. The police cruisers had already picked up the call and were closing in from opposite ends of the street. The brief excitement in the car vanished, replaced by fear so heavy it made the air thick and hard to breathe. Mason pressed harder on the accelerator. The car jolted as it gained speed, weaving through traffic that was just beginning to thin out for the evening. Brittany clutched the stolen handbags against her chest, tears forming in her eyes. None of them spoke. The noise of the engine, the sirens, and the rush of air outside the windows filled the silence completely. They had no plan now, just instinct, and instinct told them to keep running. The chase spilled out of town, moving from wide commercial streets to quieter residential areas. Children playing in front yards stopped to watch as the cars sped past, unaware of how dangerous the situation was becoming. The police held a steady distance, following without pushing to close, waiting for the right moment to act. Mason took a sharp turn onto a narrow side road lined with tall fences and dry fields, thinking he could lose them there. But each turn only made things worse. The roads twisted in unexpected directions, and every exit seemed to lead somewhere unfamiliar. Kyle tried to calm him, telling him to pull over, but Mason couldn't stop. His thoughts were racing too fast. He imagined what would happen if they were caught, the questions, the charges, the shame that would follow them back home. Brittany kept glancing out the back window, watching the flashing lights getting brighter. It felt like they were trapped inside a nightmare that had no way out. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The road ahead began to slope upward toward the mountains that framed the edge of town. Mason decided to take the route, hoping the narrow paths and sharp bends would make it harder for the police to follow. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as they left the pavement behind. The car bounced over uneven ground, sending dust and stones flying into the air. The sirens still echoed somewhere behind them, but now the sound mixed with the distant hum of wind moving through the trees. For the first time since they started running, the world around them seemed completely still, except for the shaking of the car and the pounding of their hearts. None of them knew that they had just left the safety of the town and entered a stretch of wild land where one wrong turn could mean something far worse than getting caught. The car jolted as it climbed the steep dirt path, every bump rattling through the frame. Mason gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep control as loose gravel sprayed from the tires. The town lights behind them faded into the distance until only the mountains remained, rising dark and silent against the dim evening sky. The sirens still echoed faintly, but they were getting harder to hear, muffled by the thick air and the growing sense of isolation. Mason felt a surge of hope, believing they had finally shaken off the chase. He didn't realize that the narrow road ahead was about to betray him. Kyle kept glancing out the back window, searching for any sign of the police. All he could see was a long trail of dust stretching behind them. The relief that began to creep in was fragile and thin, ready to break at any second. Brittany sat in the back, holding her arms around herself, her breathing uneven. The excitement that had driven them earlier was gone, replaced by fear and disbelief. She couldn't stop replaying the sound of the alarm, the looks from bystanders, and the blinding flashes of police lights. Every second since then felt like falling deeper into something none of them understood. The road twisted sharply, cutting through dense clusters of pine trees. Mason's knuckles turned white as he tried to keep the car steady. The surface grew rougher, with patches of mud and loose stones making it hard to keep traction. The car's headlights sliced through the dark, revealing steep drops on one side and jagged rocks on the other. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became. The wind outside howled through the trees, carrying faint echoes that made the mountain feel alive. Down below, the police were still following, but they were being cautious. The road was too dangerous for high speed. They knew the trio couldn't go much farther without running into trouble. A helicopter had been called in to track the car from above, its spotlight cutting through the dusk. Mason saw the glow sweep across the hills and felt panic tighten in his chest. He pressed harder on the gas, but the engine groaned in protest. When they reached a sharp bend near the ridge, Mason turned to fast. The tires screeched against the gravel, sliding out from under him. The car spun halfway around before crashing into a shallow ditch. The sound of metal scraping rock filled the air, followed by a heavy silence. Dust hung thick around them, making it hard to breathe. The engine sputtered once, then died completely, For a moment, no one moved. Mason sat frozen, gripping the wheel even though the car had stopped. Kyle's forehead was bleeding slightly where he had hit the dashboard. Brittany let out a trembling breath, realizing that the car wouldn't start again no matter how many times Mason turned the key. The lights flickered once before going out entirely. Outside, the forest was silent except for the faint hum of approaching engines. The sun had dipped below the mountains, leaving only the pale light of dusk. They were stranded miles from town with nowhere to run but into the wilderness. Mason opened the door slowly, the creak echoing in the stillness. The smell of dirt and pine filled the air. Somewhere down the road, the distant wail of sirens grew louder again. The three exchanged silent glances, and without another thought, they climbed out and disappeared into the trees. The sound of their footsteps faded quickly into the darkness as the police cars drew closer to the wrecked sedan, headlights cutting across the empty road. The forest swallowed them whole. As soon as they left the road, the noise of the approaching sirens faded into the distance, replaced by the quiet rustle of branches and the low hum of the wind. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and damp leaves that crunched softly beneath their shoes. Mason led the way, stumbling through the darkness, his mind racing with every possible escape route. Behind him, Kyle limped slightly, his ankle throbbing from the crash, and Brittany struggled to keep up, clutching her hoodie tight against the chill that had settled in. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The trees grew close together, their branches intertwining overhead like a ceiling. The air smelled of pine and earth, and every sound seemed to echo. The trio couldn't tell if the noises behind them were animals or officers searching through the woods. Mason tried to stay calm, but fear made it hard to think clearly. He had always believed he could control any situation, but now the forest seemed to twist in every direction, turning even his sense of direction against him. They came to a small clearing where moonlight broke through the clouds, lighting up a patch of open ground. For the first time since the chase began, they stopped to catch their breath. Kyle sat on a fallen log, wincing as he tried to stretch his injured ankle. Brittany sank to the ground beside him, her face pale and streaked with tears she hadn't noticed. Mason stood silently, scanning the dark tree line, convinced that the police would appear at any moment. The only sound was the faint chirping of crickets and the steady whisper of wind through the branches. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The cold began to settle deeper into their clothes. Mason made a decision: they couldn't stay in one place. They needed to move, to find somewhere to hide until morning. They left the clearing and pressed on, moving through thick brush and narrow trails that twisted along the hillside. The slope grew steeper, and soon the sound of running water reached them. A small stream cut across their path, its surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. Kyle lost his footing and fell hard, his injured ankle giving way completely. He groaned in pain, clutching at the dirt. Mason turned back, frustration flashing in his eyes, but there was nothing he could do. They were trapped between exhaustion and fear. Brittany knelt beside Kyle, trying to help him stand, but he couldn't walk anymore. She looked at Mason, silently begging him to slow down, but Mason's mind was already somewhere else. He thought if he could just get far enough ahead, maybe he could find help or disappear altogether. Without saying a word, he stepped back from them and turned toward the deeper woods. His footsteps faded quickly as he vanished into the trees. Brittany called out, but he didn't turn around. She and Kyle were left alone in the darkness, unsure if he was coming back. The sound of the stream masked everything else: the whisper of wind, the faint hum of distant engines, even the crunch of boots that began to move closer through the trees behind them. A helicopter's light swept across the forest canopy moments later, its beams slicing through the branches and flashing against the stream. Brittany froze as it illuminated the silver handbag lying in the mud near her feet, the same one she had tried to keep hidden. It glittered faintly in the light, giving away their position. Within minutes, the voices of officers echoed through the forest. Kyle raised his hands first, too tired to resist. Brittany followed, her knees weak, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Farther up the hill, Mason crouched behind a fallen tree, watching the scene unfold from a distance. The beam of the helicopter passed over him once, catching the edge of his jacket before moving on. He didn't move until he heard the officers calling out names and the click of handcuffs echoing faintly through the woods. Only then did he realize how far everything had gone. The forest that had promised escape now felt like a cage, and every path around him led only deeper into it. The next morning broke cold and gray over the mountains. Mist drifted through the trees, softening the outlines of the police cars that lined the dirt road near the crash site. The forest that had felt endless during the night was now quiet and still. Officers moved methodically through the area, marking footprints, collecting evidence, and securing the abandoned car. Inside, the stolen handbags and watches were found scattered across the seats, a reminder of how quickly greed had unraveled everything. Down by the stream, Brittany and Kyle sat wrapped in blankets. Their faces pale and blank from exhaustion, neither spoke much. They'd spent the night in custody, answering questions they barely had the energy to process. The helicopter hovered overhead once more, its spotlight sweeping slowly across the treetops. Mason was still missing. The officers believed he couldn't have gone far on foot. The terrain was steep, uneven, and cold enough to make even short distances brutal. A search team moved into the woods at sunrise, following fresh footprints that cut through the mud. Every few minutes they called out his name, their voices echoing across the valley. Mason, meanwhile, was hiding less than a mile away, crouched inside an old drainage tunnel near a creek. He hadn't slept at all, his clothes were damp, and his hands shook from both cold and fear. As the morning dragged on, the sound of approaching voices grew closer. Mason's thoughts spiraled. He thought about how it had started just a simple idea, a quick thrill, a way to make some extra money. He had told himself it was harmless, that nobody would ever know. Now he sat in the dirt, staring at his reflection in a puddle, wondering when everything had slipped out of his control. The weight of what he had done pressed heavier than the cold. When the light from the helicopter passed over the tunnel again, he finally stood up. The silver handbag he had carried was still slung over his shoulder. He dropped it in the mud and stepped out into the open. It didn't take long for the officers to find him. They called out, told him to stop, and within moments he was on his knees, hands raised, too tired to argue. The forest was silent again except for the sound of footsteps and the distant hum of the helicopter fading away. Mason didn't fight as the handcuffs clicked into place. The rush that had once felt so thrilling was gone, replaced by a dull emptiness he couldn't escape. Back at the Riverton Police Department, the three of them were reunited in silence. The reality of what they had done settled like a fog none of them could shake off. They sat in separate rooms, signing papers and answering questions under the tired gaze of officers who had seen this kind of story too many times before. News crews had already gathered outside, reporting on the chase, the crash, and the arrests. By noon, footage of their failed escape was circulating online, turning them into a brief but unforgettable cautionary tale. When the charges were finally read, the room stayed quiet. They faced counts of theft, fleeing police, and reckless endangerment. It was more than any of them had expected when they walked into that store the day before. In their minds, it had been just another game, another daring rush that would end in laughter and bragging later. Instead, it ended in concrete walls, mugshots, and silence. As night fell again over Riverton, the town returned to its usual calm. The shopping center reopened, the alarm fixed, and the employees went back to their routines. But for Mason, Kyle, and Brittany, time slowed to a crawl. The lesson hung heavy between them, unspoken but clear. Choices made in a moment can last far longer than anyone imagines.